No, it's actually quite interesting how many fascinating stories there are with First Nation women. But even in this area, there's so much history out here. Is that one of the things that you love about our community?
Oh yeah, and you know, it's as I mentioned earlier that when I went to work at Douglas Lake in 1967, and the guys I worked with were from Spokane, Upper Nicola Number 3, it's called officially, but it's the Spokane Reserve. And a woman who became a very, very dear friend of mine, Sophie Sophie was a cook in our camp for about 3 years. And cooking in a cow camp it's one of the worst jobs in the world. You know, you're all by yourself, way back in the woods. Boys get up in the morning, get off their horses and ride away, and there you are, by yourself, somewhere up in the mountains, by yourself all day long.
Yeah.
And then people come home and they're too tired to talk anyway, they just go to sleep.
Yeah.
But Sophie tried to teach me some of the Nicola language, and the Nicola language is now pretty much extirpated. And it was an Athapascan language. Everybody else here speaks Coast Salish varieties. But the old Nicola was Athapascan. It's the same as the Chilcotin and the Navajo. It's just, you know, kind of weird offshoots. And so it wasn't until years later, till I actually got here, and I heard about this fellow named James Tate, who had come here from the Shetland Islands in the 1870s, settled in Spence's Bridge. And Tate started to document the history of local people. Not from the point of view of some superior white, but just because he was a local person. Married a native woman, Spence's Bridge, and he collected all the stories of the Tonkin and the Plaquemine people. My pronunciation is still very, very bad. And he started to put the stuff together, and he became, he's still not largely known, but he was one of North America's most important ethnographers and kind of anthropologists. And so I happened upon Tate's writing online and found the history, the real history of the Nicola people. So suddenly I found out that, oh, Sophie Chuliditsio, our cook, was in fact the great-granddaughter of a very famous chief, Chuliditsio. And so she was nobility, right? She was real honest-to-God nobility. And just working away at cooking for a bunch of guys in a cow camp.
Yeah.
And it gave me a whole different sense of the way the flavor of the country works, you know, and where people came from. And then I've had friends of mine that I rode with for years who said to me in the last 10 years, just quietly, well, you know, yeah, I went to residential school. We never talked about that in those days at all. Never talked about it. Over at Douglas Lake, there's a lake called Pennask Lake that was surrounded by a white guy, an American guy, John Dole, who surveyed all the lots around Pennask Lake and made it a private lake in 1927, so he could establish a fish and game club. Well, people from down in North Bend, down by Boston Bar, and all around this country have been fishing there for millennia, right? And they had all the rituals: who fished in the spring, who fished in the fall, how do you divide it up among the various the nations and the tribes and the bands and the families, and then all of a sudden, boom, it's a private lake. You can't fish here anymore. Just like that, whack! And that was only 40 years before I was riding around up there. So this might not have been in the memory of the guys I was riding with, but it was absolutely in the memory of their parents. Never mentioned, never ever talked about. So when I start to find this stuff in history, I go, man, we've been living. I grew up in Quebec where we used to say de solitude, right? Where the English and the French facts were different. When I was a kid in northern Quebec, it was war in the woods with the French, but this was a different kind of de solitude where there was no communication. So that you could grow up here being white and have not the foggiest idea that the people next to you had been abused in a residential school.